And I think the first thing I want to share is that Linda volunteers for Smile on Seniors, which we are very grateful. Her husband and Linda have played a role in some of the renovations that have happened in the Chabad house over here, which I look at pictures from our first Shabbat dinners that we've hosted to after we did the change with their supplies. And it is a night and day more beautiful building. But that is not why we have Linda today. It's not to talk about any furnishings and finishings in a home or in a building, but rather Linda has authored a book. It's an award-winning book. It's called Looking Up, a Memoir of Sisters, Survivors, and Skokie. And it's really a story of her own childhood. And it teaches some of the best methods that today we're going to listen to some of the best methods that she has learned in her 20 years of study and access to her Jewish story, and share it with us, different ways that we can create our own memoir, sort of write our own. I call it I think sort of a continuation of other discussions we've had here, which is a living legacy for yourself. You can call it a memoir, you can call it your story, you can use whatever title you are comfortable with, but really it's a lot of tools and insights into really making sure that you have your story and that you can share it with others and things that you have learned over your time. And even if you're, the way I look at it is, even if you're not writing a memoir, these are important, I think, tools that we should have for ourselves to be able to teach it to our children, what we want our children to know about us, what we want them to know about our heritage. So Linda today is going to share things that have inspired herself, things that have played a role in her own search and in her own memoir, and things that we can all learn from. So thank you, Linda.
Sure. Okay, I'm up, right? Thank you, Levi. Thanks for those introductory comments. I appreciate it. So I'm here today with a vastly abbreviated, talk about writing down your life stories and about specifically writing down your Jewish life stories. People don't realize that history is like passing by in our lifetimes. When your kids will say, "Why are you using vintage measuring cups, Mom?" or something, and it's like, yeah, my life is part of history. The things I've owned since my marriage began almost 30 years ago are in antique stores. Okay. And so I think we have to remember our stories are disappearing all the time. And if we want to write a record for our kids that has more than our names and, date of wedding and date of bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, there are some techniques that you can learn to actually write it down in a way that keeps you writing. I don't know how many people in here have ever tried to write, and then let me put this on the other view, and found that it was impossible. Like you start writing one sentence and it doesn't look the way you had figured it would look in your head. And, you kind of peter out, like you just stop. My mother was a Holocaust survivor, as was my father. And my father died way back, like when I was a teenager. And my mom would get this sun-burning impulse to write her story because she didn't want her story to die, right? And, we'd buy her whatever, a word processor, a computer, a printer, give her every tool on the planet. But the actual tools that she needed, and in case you want to write, this is what you will find helpful, is just ways to find your way into a story. Okay. I started writing about 20 years ago. I had gone through a brain tumor and I was 40, and I suddenly realized that the book I had meant to write my whole life had not been written and I could have died. And so it turns out, time wasn't on my side, right? And so I showed up at a community college class, and despite the fact of having a degree, which had kept me back for so long, because how could I take a class at a community college? And I started learning, and my professor taught me like one really important thing right away about writing memoir. She taught me to use the word I. Okay, first person. I had been taught you never use the word I. And it's like, you know, they stamped it out of me. You know what I mean? It was like, you are not allowed to use the word I ever. And try to write a memoir if you can't use the word I, because we have to be in our own stories, you know? Um, there is some idea that unless we think our story is so interesting, it's not worth writing down. But I think Jewish stories are really interesting. You know, I love Jewish stories. I when I think about the way people grow up, like when I think about, let's say, Levi's story, and I think, yeah, I want to hear about growing up with all these brothers. I want to hear about that. My story was about growing up in Skokie with two Holocaust survivor parents and six sisters, which obviously was very unusual for the time. But my mother had some idea that she was going to like reproduce single-handedly the Jewish people, like we'd each have seven kids and then each one of them would have seven kids or something. Um, that's not what happened. But I grew up in a very safe place, like completely safe, right? Skokie in the 60s was magical. It was just magical, You walk out of your house, there's gangs of kids to play with. There are bikes and hopscotches and jump rope. And you can ride over to a park and that park and this park. And it was like a giant, mishpacha, right? It's like a big family. There were my school friends and then there were my neighborhood friends. However, I knew that my parents hadn't grown up the same way. That every time, I wrote in my book about how it was like, I walk in my house and it's 1941 instead of 1971, which it might have been or something. I think it's the nature of trauma to relive those things, relive them. And my mom would always say, who's going to write my story? Who is going to write my story? And we had 3 or 4 doors from the house and we'd all just whoosh, we're just like out the door. Because I do think that children of survivors have different ways of handling this. Some of them very much attach onto their parents' story. And in our family, it was like we got wiggly. We had to run from the story. Um, and so I wasn't exactly planning on writing that story, but I was planning on writing a story of a magical childhood. Okay. And I did that, a crazy, wacky childhood with 7 sisters in one family, and Holocaust survivor parents. But I wasn't planning on putting her story in there until I got probably like a couple of years into it and workshopping it with other classmates. And people said, you can't really just throw Holocaust survivors in a story and not tell us what happened. And so I sat down with my mother and I got her story. And so I spliced it in there. So it's, there is some mirroring of the fact that, when I'm 11, here's the great life I have. And when my mom's 11, the Nazis march into her town. And so, you know, that idea of growing up differently and needing to pay attention, like food is a loaded issue and don't throw out the crust of bread. And we're not, my family wasn't kosher and didn't believe in God because, look, God didn't save us. I felt differently about those things. And I somehow resisted their atheism. I don't know exactly how. But anyway, so what I've always loved about memoir is that it lets me bring people back to life on the page. And my dad died in 1975, and wow, he's fully alive in my book. He's a laundryman. He speaks 5 languages fluently, but not English, or he spoke it, but he spoke it in a way where people would like kind of denigrate him or correct him or something. And also because of my parents' particular stories, I ended up with a giant family, which was a little unusual for children of Holocaust survivors, of course. But my mom lived in the forest. And so her family came out intact. They ran away before the final massacre. And my dad's family was transported to Siberia. And one aunt died and a newborn nephew died. But he came out with 5 siblings, with 5 of them and grandparents. So I had grandparents on both sides. So it was like a little pocket of Eastern Europe in the middle of Skokie, Illinois. Okay. Um, anyway, so when I think about my Jewish story, like I remember always thinking, I don't really have the right to a Jewish story. Look at my broken parents, look at my parents. I mean, is this a Jewish story? 7 daughters, nobody bat mitzvahed. They ran from any kind of connection with rabbis or with synagogues. And then, I realized that is a Jewish story. Okay. It's all a Jewish story. The idea of growing up, however I grew up, the Jewish flavors of my story, the questing for a deeper connection back to Judaism, that's all a Jewish story. Um, anyway, so I just want to, let's see, I want to cover a few things. Like if you're interested in writing, you don't have to write a book. You can start really small. Okay. There's a few tips I have that I learned right away that really allowed me to enter my story. I used to think, I'm going to write this story about Skokie and no Holocaust, and it's going to like look like this, whatever. And every time I'd start writing, it would kind of fall apart on the page. But my professor not only taught me to use the word I and to allow myself into it, but she taught me to write small. Okay. So maybe instead of writing this giant sweeping thing, I'm writing one story, one day, maybe 1 hour. Okay. Um, you know, what I found is that each story contained the whole DNA of my book, of my story, right? If I was writing about how my like we only called chicken parts by Yiddish words, right? And so I would venture out to go have dinner at a friend's house and they'd say, "What would you like, Linda?" And I'd say, "A polka and a fliegel," and the American Jewish parents would look at me like I had just grown another head. Okay. So if you think about that story actually has an underlying theme of being a stranger. Like no matter how much I want to look like I'm American, there's something in me that's different than the kids whose parents were here or whose grandparents were here. So when overwhelmed, start small. That's like a really important thing. I had a professor who said, don't write about your whole town. Don't even write about your whole house. Write about a brick of the house. And it was meant metaphorically, but to write small. I wrote a story in my book about the day my aunt died. And she died in 69, like on a operating table. Oh, sorry, I just saw the question. What's a fliegel? A fliegel is a wing, a chicken wing. I only knew the words fliegel and polka, which are drumstick and wing. It's still a little hard for me to translate. So anyway, so I wrote this story about my aunt, and it was from my perspective with, like my mom just starts crying on a telephone call and my dad stops demanding his dinner. And, it's like, oh, this is a different day. This day is different. My parents disappear from the house, they go to my grandparents and I sit there and I have the news to share with the neighborhood. Okay. So anyway, okay, another tip is to allow yourself to start in the middle or at the end. Okay. Like if I wanted to write a story about my Jewish marriage, I don't have to start with the day I met my husband at Jewish Singles. I could start under the chuppah, right? And then go back, right? Go back to meeting him at Jewish Singles, or I could start it today, you know. Um, what I found is every story has a different entrance point. And it's when I find that point where I want to start, it like lets me channel the story, like get the story down on paper. So I had to allow myself to use first person, but also present tense. So one of the things that I do in my book and my second book, which is almost done, um, is I allow myself to speak through the voice of the kid, like the kid. Okay, this kid growing up in Skokie is a little annoyed by Yiddish, right? Like, I'm like, why can't they speak in English? I don't understand them. Do I feel like that as an adult? No, I wish I had learned it. Okay. Um, but, to allow the child or the teenager or the 20 something you or 30 something you to allow them to have their worldview is a very beautiful thing. Like there were all these ideas I had as a kid that were absolutely incorrect. I thought that all white people were Jewish. I just did. I grew up in Skokie. I mean, we went to integrated schools, but all the white kids were Jewish. And I grew up with this sense of, what's normal and what's not normal. And when I moved out here, I was only in eighth grade, but I continued with that worldview. I continued to think that being Jewish was the best thing in the world, and I kind of felt sorry for people who weren't. But that's what my worldview was. It was a sense of normalcy and equilibrium about it. Um, also present tense allows us to write a scene, put dialogue in as best we remember it, and to kind of make things a little bit more lively. I'm going to read a little excerpt that is not in present tense, but it could easily be in present tense. Um, you know, like most of the work is, and I feel like it really lets the kid come alive again. Okay. When I'm writing about growing up with seven sisters, I'm not writing from the point of view of a 60-year-old. Okay. I'm writing from what it was like growing up in this crazy house. And to me, that helps that story get across. Um, Also, now when I teach a class, because I teach a bigger class, I allow like it's really important to brainstorm ideas, right? I have a writing exercise that I use normally, and it's called the rules of, right? And you would write, what were the rules of my teenage household? What were the rules of dinner time? What were the rules of going to a bar mitzvah? Okay, bat mitzvah, what were the rules of school, right? And so as I start thinking, oh, well, these were our rules, it can be kind of wacky, you know. I've taught people who, the rule, I mean, whatever, they finish everything on their plate. They have to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. Like my family, it was like eat quick because the other sisters are going to get the food. Okay. Um, you know, this idea of brainstorming, means that you don't allow the inner critic to come out and judge what you've written down. Okay. If you write 100 items, if you have 5 really good ones, that's good. That gives you a place to start. Okay. Don't worry about the other ones. I have 52 writers' journals. They're above my head, but I have a fake background, so I can't show them. And each one has between 70 and 120 pages. And, my material is in there. Some of it I won't ever use. Okay. But I did put pen to paper and I did the exercise of letting a story come out. And even if some of them weren't the best version of something that later goes in a book, it's okay. It's okay. It kept me writing. So now I am going to read just like a couple pages from my book. Can I see the cover? I don't know. There it is. There it is. Okay. So here it goes. My mother shopped for food like an Eastern European, which she was. like a person who nearly starved to death at one point in her life, which of course she nearly did. Mom didn't know how to shop like an American. She didn't understand the concepts of dessert. She didn't quite get packaged food. Even the idea of snacks and breakfast were a stretch. She can never find any meat pre-cut or pre-packaged to her liking in any meat department anywhere. She always has to insistently ring the buzzer in the meat department in order to have a personal consultation with the butcher, waving her hands, making chopping motions, stirring motions to punctuate her desires and her plan for the meat. And so they'll understand the cut she wants. She can't make do with the Goyish cuts of meat like round or round. She needs Jewish cuts, like short ribs, the ever-present flanken, skirt steaks. On the one hand, Mom is trying, I'm sorry, wait, oops. I tipped something over, I'm sorry. Let me get back. Am I back? Okay. On the one hand, my mother was trying to become American as fast as she could. She knew the 7 of us would have to be twiggy thin to attract American husbands, and that her ultimate pride as a mother would be in marrying us off. On the other hand, her Eastern European hand, Mom had a deep emotional longing to see plump children, the better to ward off malnutrition for when the Nazis come again. So which to have, plump children or thin children? American looking children or Eastern European looking children? She ended up with a few of each, fat and thin. Once she gets home, Mom whittles the meat further down into something else. She sets up her heavy steel grinder on the edge of the counter, grinding the meat into tiny pellets until she's made her own ground beef. Then she mixes it by hand with eggs and breadcrumbs to make burgers. She puts some meat in a big wooden bowl and hacks away at it with a short meat cleaver until she's tenderized her own steaks. My mom has to actually touch the meat, get in the bowl with the meat, stomp around with the meat. She has to transform the meat from its original to something better. She makes meat into magic. She doesn't trust the butchers at the supermarket to do any of this for her, not in their white aprons behind their glass window, not with their union that lets them shut down the whole meat department well before the rest of the grocery store closes, casting the whole end of the store into darkness. Mom grew up with Jewish ritual slaughterers, not just a union, a closing time, and they're gone, like these Americans. It's impossible for them to understand that to her it's not just food, it's spiritual. If she believed in God, he'd look like a steak in heaven. If they had starved in the forest like I did, she tells me after one of these encounters, they wouldn't be throwing away so much perfectly good food, fat. Because it turns out that even fat is food to us. It's not garbage. Beef fat mixed with flour, sugar, sauteed onion, and then stuffed in a casing makes kishka a staple of our diet. That's the reading portion. Let's see if we have time. I wanted to do a short exercise. I don't know if everybody has pencil and paper. If you can grab some, and not everybody has to do this, but there's a nice prompt that can get you right into the, just starting to write, okay? Sometimes prompts I find very static and unmoving, and so I can't do them, but I like a trailing sentence, okay? So one of them I use is, the thing about my family is, okay? Start 10 sentences like that. The thing about my family is my sisters spoke Yiddish before they spoke English, right? The thing about my family is we're the wrong kind of Jewish, okay? These are all things, the thing about my family. So can we do, Levi, can we do a few minutes of
Sure.
writing
Yeah,
time? Yeah.
you can do as you want, as you'd
Yeah.
like.
Also, I found there's what I'm really trying to say is, or what happened is this, okay? And those kind of things where you can fill in the end of the sentence will get you quicker into your story, okay? So, so does
Do you want
everybody,
people to share their answers, or
we might not have time with Q&A, but we can, it's it's too short of a time for a real workshop.
Right. No,
But
I'm saying, do you want people like whoever, I'm sure not everyone is, going to share their answer to some of
yeah,
those
yeah,
prompts, but
right.
you can choose a volunteer.
Sure, sure. So you guys want to take a minute or two right now to write the answer, like continue the sentence. The thing about my family is, okay? It could just be one full sentence, okay?
And Linda, while they're doing that, a question
Yeah.
from what I think I understood from what you were saying is when you wrote your own memoir, it wasn't necessarily one long story. It was more about, I'm going to talk about this, write it down, I'm going to write it, and then stitched it together.
Yeah, it's a horrible way to write a book, I have to tell you, now that I've put together my second one. Um, yeah, I write in single stories, I would highly recommend instead using like an outline method. But to me, when the inspiration strikes to write a something that happened, I just have to write it. The problem is I've written, let's say my father dying, I wrote that probably 10 or 20 times, just because it was kind of where my mind dwelled. And then I had to pick the best one or the best pieces out of them to be, that's part of the second book. But yeah, so as far as it goes, like my books have structure, right? So they start somewhere, they end up somewhere. They're not like a big mishmash. It's just harder for me to create that finished product out of it, having written separate pieces. But I honestly, this is just the way I write, you know? And I wish I could do it another way. And if you can do it another way, do it another way.
But for
Because,
those of us
yeah,
on here that aren't necessarily going to be writing a book,
yeah, yeah.
then it's a very good idea.
Right, right. And life stories, just writing life stories, just start somewhere. Just pick something. You could start with your wedding. You don't have to start with when you were born. Today, you want to write about your marriage. Tomorrow, you want to write about the birth of one child. The next day, you want to write about the town you lived in. So if you think of it like almost as a camera lens, and you think that sometimes the camera pulls out and you can see a view, like a wide view. Here's Chicago. I grew up where Elsie, the cow, started the Chicago fire. I grew up in the land of Lincoln, all of this stuff, right? And then I narrowed down. And how narrow do I go? Do I go to my neighborhood? Do I go to the alley? Do I go inside my house? Do I tell a story of one day, or do I tell a story that recurred so many times that I tell it like that? But feel free to jump around, right? You can always number them later and put them in order if you want to leave them to kids, for
Right.
children, right? Yeah.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
In the sense of memoirs, what do you think is the reason that they sell? In other
Oh,
words, it's your story. Do you know what I mean? Like what,
yeah.
and I know that I've read a number of memoirs. I'm sure many
Hmm.
of the people on today have as well. I
Yeah.
just wonder, like, why are we so intrigued
Yeah.
in someone else's story?
Well, I think the truth is stranger than fiction, as they say. I wouldn't necessarily write a fiction book with 7 daughters of Holocaust survivors, but that is the truth. And that to me is more interesting than fiction. Um, I think that people like to read about others' lives, and I know that they want to get a bigger message out of it. Like people look for themselves in memoirs, right? And they look for a greater truth about life, right? So it's like here's my life, and here's, as a reader, how I find my life in this book. Like it reflects it back to me, and it teaches me something. Like I might have thought something all along, about whatever, being Jewish or growing up with these siblings or whatever, but maybe I, the writer, am the one who puts that into word. And there's that moment of recognition where you're like, yes, yes, that is what it's like. And so that's a powerful thing to give people, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I have some more questions, but I wonder if anyone wants to share
Yeah.
their,
Does anyone want to share their sentence?
and again, if you did write one and you're not
Yeah.
shy, just unmute your mic.
Right.
Um,
There's no
Please
bad
chime
work.
in.
Hmm.
Steve, did you write something that you want to share? You're muted though if you do have one.
Oh, I've just gotten some ideas from Linda
Okay.
because I've been working on, I was told not to call it a memoir because you had to be famous to write a
Oh.
memoir. But
Yeah.
I've been documenting my life, but
Hmm.
but you write a story, and my background is to be very succinct and terse. So
Sure.
it's like a newspaper article. So
Mm.
um, it's
Yeah. And
the structure is quite different from what you've done.
yeah, when you get into learning memoir, there is a story arc that's all true, but you think of your life in story. But what you're now, memoir can be any person. Okay. Normally, the difference between what you're talking about, which is more autobiography, is that memoir will take a small chunk of time.
Right.
Okay. My book was like 1968 to 1973 and kind of reflected on all that. But you might be using chronology, right? Or you might just be using facts. For me, it was very important to write a story that people wanted to read, like with all the elements of fiction, but yet is totally a true story. Okay. So that's what creative nonfiction and memoir refer to. But autobiography is fine. And also don't shy away from writing memoir if that's what, there's no rules. Like somebody can't just hit you over the head and tell you can't write that. It can be very powerful to leave your children this kind of stuff too, talking about the magic of childhood, you know, um, something that fleshes out the story of when I lived and when I died, right? Yeah.
Steve, I'll buy your book.
I don't think you want to read it.
Mm.
I don't even show my kids who want to read it.
Yeah, yeah.
But my
It's
motivation was that I'm always interested in family genealogy. And one of the things I regret is not quizzing my grandparents when they were still alive to find out. And one of my aunts got my paternal grandfather to write down his life. So he scribbled a couple of pages, and then his last sentence was, "I'll finish this later," and he never finished it. And I don't want to put my grandkids or succeeding generations in that position.
Mhm.
I'm trying to document
Sure.
everything that's gone on in my life in a very terse fashion.
Okay. Well, it's your choice. I mean, some of these techniques can get the writing easier, you know, um, and um, the idea of studying genealogy. Normally, in genealogy, we're missing a lot of information. We're missing what their lives were really like, Um, and for you to really say, this is what it was like. This is what it was like being a teenager. This is what it was like without computers, without cell phones. This is what life was like. Like that's part of what makes a story interesting, the little details. Even if you just mentally describe the house you grew up in, that's kind of an interesting exercise, as opposed to, I got married, here was the synagogue, blah, 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 here's our ketubah, like actually go there, be there, Anyway, but good luck to you, Steve. I appreciate it. Yeah. And did anybody want to share a
Yeah,
sentence that wrote?
anyone, feel free to chime in over here.
Yeah.
Don't
And
be shy.
if you don't want to, just write like 50 answers to that. Okay. The thing about my family is, okay, because you can chop off the thing about my family is, and you can write, the rest of it is the story. This is intended to give you an entry point where you can finish the sentence. Okay. Yeah. So if nobody wants to share theirs, we can do some Q&A, right? Leland?
Sure. Yeah. And I have one other question before others
Okay.
ask questions. After writing your first, I guess, memoir, what did it do? I guess you have children yourself. So how did that
Mhm.
change maybe your own perspective on being a parent, maybe, or even just your own household?
Right. I mean, you know, my kids were, well, my daughter especially was very proud. Like she was really happy, you know. No matter what else I do, she's always like, "Oh, my mom's an author." You know, now she's 21. But but you know, I mean, it's a very interesting thing that some of the eyes you so much want to avoid, the people watching you, are the people who never read it. Okay. um, my husband and my kids haven't read my book. You know, I think, you know, when they've been like, "Oh, I've got to write about the Holocaust for this class. Can you tell me exactly which pages are Booby's story?" You know, I would give them exactly those pages. And you know, it's kind of like me not wanting to touch my mother's story for so long. You know, it took me till I was 45 to even sit down with her and not want to fly out of my chair. So that's fine, you know. I would say that I hesitated writing the second book because it's got the teen years, which were pretty wild in the 70s out here. And I kind of wanted my kids to get older than their teen years and not have them read things that might encourage bad behavior. So now we're well past that. They're 25 and 21. So yeah, so I'm moving towards getting that out there. Yeah.
And did you self-publish or that was through a publisher?
I self-published after having two bad experiences with agents. And it turns out I'm kind of a control freak. And I'm a developmental editor and I teach memoir. I'm very picky, okay? You know, this second book, I hired an editor. And the first book, I had some like what they call beta readers, which are people who read your stuff and tell you, you know, without paying for it. Let's say it's an editor
Right.
without paying for it. Um, yeah, and now my editor said I should not self-publish the second one, but I am thinking I am such a control freak. I want to pick my cover. I want to pick the beginning and the end. I remember the things that came up with the agents that I had, you know, represent me, and I was uncomfortable with it. And so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much more time I'm going to spend banging my head against, you know, the wall. It's very hard to traditionally publish after you've self-published. So I'm not sure, you know, I'm almost at 10 years here since the first one. And time, like I said before, is not on my side. I have more books to write. So I might do that. Thanks, Levi.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. All right, if anyone has any questions for Linda, please don't be shy. You can use the chat or you can use your mic. If it's about her specific book or about writing your own memoir, she is here for any question you have.
Yeah.
Lou, did you have any question?
Oh, okay. So Rena asked, why is it harder to self-publish? You know, my book sold very well for a self-published book. It sold about 5,000 copies. I think the pass around rate was probably over 10,000 from what I could tell. I have really great reviews on Amazon, but you know, agents like the literary you know, field, like in New York now, it's gotten kind of tougher, like a smaller and smaller thing. You know, the rope is higher, and you know, they're like, give me a reason why I don't want to take this book. Okay, so if I say I was self-published, delete. You know, it's like it's an automatic delete. I've even like been at a seminar with an agent and said, if my book sold really good, and if I have all these readers who are ready to buy it again, you know, why? And he said they want a sure thing that's going to sell 20,000 copies. Okay. So the way to get attention from traditional publishing is by having, you know, something that sells so many copies that it comes to their attention. And it's very rare. We've all heard of very rare books that are self-published and picked up. You know, it's kind of a money game. And, you know, I have to say that I'm kind of in it for the story, and I'm not looking for, you know, something that's going to make me so much money that I would compromise my story in any way. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions, whether through chat or through?
Hi, Linda, this is Rena again. I just want to say I really like what you said about taking something and getting it down, finishing the sentence, finishing it multiple times. When I was about 10 or 11, I actually had a Sunday school teacher who wanted us to write a paper. And she told us, she was a public school teacher, and she told us how to write our paper. And she said, get a bunch of index cards. Of course, it was before computers, and write a thought on each card. And then you can sort the cards later and divide them into paragraphs and chapters or whatever. She wasn't thinking books, she wasn't thinking chapters, she was thinking an essay. But as I've written things in my adult life, I've used that. Of course, now I do it on a computer, but I might have a file with a little bit of this and another file with a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And when it starts telling me where it wants to go, then I put it together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, index card methods are still being used. Okay. I took a 4-day seminar at the UCLA Writers Workshop all about story arc. Even, most of the people in there were writing fiction, but story arc applies to almost anything. I mean, it applies to essays, it applies to here's where the story's going. Nobody's going to want to read my book if the story's not going anywhere. Nobody wants to read my diary from when I was 14. Okay. There's a reason why I shape it. So this professor was really into colored note cards. and it was like, here's your first act. It was the hero's journey, which is like famous, right? Here's your first act, and here's the peak of the first act, and here's the second act, and this is the hero's journey. And when you're down on the other side of it, this is like the strange new world after the thing happened. Okay. So my second book is my dad died, right? And from this strange new world, you can never go back to what you were before, which is true for life. Okay. But yeah, I don't think exactly like a note card person, but it's a great method. And there were people who were very far along on their books and they had used it, and it helped them to splice in scenes, chronology, all of that, what it was building to. Yeah. So I agree, Rena. It's a great method.
Thank you.
Yes. Kay, I see your hand.
When I was in college and had to take freshman composition, I just about died because I was not a writer and I was terrified of writing, but I had to. And so in that particular class, the technique that was suggested to us was you just called it free writing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a commonly used concept today, but he just said, sit down and start writing, just write random thoughts and put them together later. And now in the day of computers, that was computers, of course. Now with computers, it's much easier to reorder and resplice thoughts like that, but it gets your mind going. And it totally took away the terror because I didn't have to have the finished product in my mind before I started. I just started writing.
Yeah, and there's one writer's manual that talks about always start with your free writing pages. Just start there because it'll get all the junk out of your head. I didn't find it useful for me. I don't know why. Certain techniques work and certain don't. One thing, Anne Lamott wrote, what is it called? Birds. Let me look it up really quick. Anyway, she wrote about having a kind of bad first draft to allow yourself to just write and have like a first draft that whatever, you just get it down, get a first draft down. It's not the end of the world. Oh, it's Bird by Bird. God, how did I forget that? So Bird by Bird, she calls it by a different name, but it's a profanity, so I'm not going to use it here. But it's like just write, and then you can always pick out something from the writing that you can carry forth. And it's very similar to the free writing. And free writing, for me, it never produced the kind of stuff I want to produce, but the getting out the first kind of bad draft, that always helped. Yeah. So
That's pretty much what the suggestion was just to get started. And
yeah,
for me, it really worked. It just got my mind flowing because I didn't have the roadblock of feeling like I had to, anything that I put down on the page had to be the finished product.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm trying to look up the person who's super famous for that. So many people have copied her. I'll message it to Levi afterward, so he can send it to you with the bird by bird information, Yeah, it's all good. Anything that gets you writing is good, right? Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you. Don't be shy if you have a question.
Lydia, have you this is Rita again. Have you decided the title for your second book?
When I sent it to the editor, it was called Uprooted. And it's probably going to have a subtitle of, Skokie, Scottsdale in the 70s. So a memoir. I hate to do the S's again because my first one had it. I'm not sure. I've called it Seven Sisters. I've called it Jewish Girls Gone Wild, but I'm probably not going to use that because it's, I don't know if my sisters would appreciate me, saying that because ultimately, I have to tell my story.
But still more copies though.
Yeah, I guess. I actually queried a bunch of agents with that title and I didn't get anywhere. I don't know why sometimes I don't get anywhere. It could be anything, it could be whatever, Holocaust story, 70s story, the title, the being self-published, I don't know for sure. But yeah, I do love that title. And I can like imagine the cover with like somebody really nerdy, who's going wild, because it's a funny dichotomy, Jewish girls and going wild, right? So yeah, we'll see. You can look up my present book, which is called Looking Up, on Amazon, and it's always print on demand, so it's always available.
Thank
Linda,
you.
another question. Did you publish through Amazon's little platform for self-publishing?
I did. Yeah, I did. KDP, which is Kindle. Well, it used to be called CreateSpace. Okay. So in 2011, I used CreateSpace and it was amazing. I mean, let's put it this way. By the time my second child was having her bat mitzvah, I knew how to do desktop publishing. Okay. Like when I made a program, wow. I mean, yeah, it was very interesting because ultimately you have to get a book that might have 300 pages in a Word document into a book that is only going to be about 6 by 9, and the answer isn't going tinier and tinier in the fonts. So there was a lot of knowledge that had to be gained. I paid for the Kindle conversion. And that was fine because I wasn't going to start becoming a IT person. But yeah, I found I loved doing it. And then I hired my own book cover designer. And I uploaded it. And then later when I won the grand prize in the Writer's Digest contest, they gave me an emblem, like a seal. And I redid my cover with the seal on it. So yeah, it was great. I don't know how much of a control freak I am, but I know I love my cover and I know I love my content. And that's really important to me. Anything else?
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other last questions? If not, I will, Linda, I'll say thank you so much. This was very informative, and I know everyone here appreciates all those little tips and tidbits, so thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you guys for being here.